I've wanted to do something a bit different with this channel for quite a while, something that merges documentary and video essay and hopefully offers a more personal insight into action cinema. Luckily, I was given that opportunity recently, and so me and my cameraman Ben made the long, arduous journey from London to Cardiff, which is why you're now seeing these awkward images of me on the way there.
What are you expecting when we get there?
Are you actually recording an interview?
Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
To visit a filmmaker that needs little introduction. Gareth Evans, of course, is the director of Merentau, the Raid series, and Apostle, along with co-directing VHS2's Safe Haven.
Okay, cut. Okay, once more, yeah.
And we got the chance to meet with him during the action design phase of his new film, Havoc, to discuss his cinematic journey to this point. So Gareth, could you talk about what led to your first foray into filmmaking?
I grew up in a small village in Wales called Hirwaun. I always dreamt of making films, and then I reached a point where I was about 17 or 18, everyone was kind of looking to get their first car. I was looking to get my first camcorder. You know, watching behind the scenes features on DVDs, so like the making of Magnolia and then the making of From Dusk Till Dawn, Full Tilt Boogie, that sort of made me realise it was a career and an industry I wanted to kind of be involved with. On the back of that, I met Matt Flannery in university, and one day I wanted to make a short film. I needed somebody to hold the camera, and that was kind of the start. Then we started making small short films, stuff that you'll never ever see. And that led us to decide to take a sabbatical off work for a month so we could go off and just shoot Footsteps, which was a 16 to 20 day shoot, small little independent feature.
There are flashes of what I'd call your style present in Footsteps. Did you know then that you wanted to make the type of action film you've become so known for today?
I think that was more informed by going into Indonesia, because for me, when we made Footsteps, at that time I still thought that I would be more of a sort of European art house filmmaker. That was the kind of cinema I was more interested in terms of what I was watching. And that first one was me kind of just trying to figure out who I was as a filmmaker and trying to borrow a lot from different filmmakers, trying to borrow from Kitano and from Mike and things like that, and trying to, because I was a big fan of Japanese cinema obviously, and that was very heavily influencing me. It had extremity in there, and so that was something I was starting to explore in Footsteps. Not as polished, obviously, as what I've been able to do since. What I took away from Footsteps was just this realization of this had to be what I did next. Obviously then, in terms of going further and deeper into the industry, that didn't really happen. I didn't really sort of find myself and figure out what I wanted to do in film until I went out to Indonesia to work on the documentary. I had made a documentary out in Indonesia, through which I got to meet a number of people who ended up becoming a major part of the work I've done since. I met Iko, and I met Yayan, I met Edwell, who was the choreographer for Merentau alongside Iko and the rest of the team. And I also met Cecep, who fought against Iko in the Raid 2. And I knew from the documentary, once we met Iko for the first time, that I was like, this kid's got a certain screen presence, he's got a charisma to him. And I remember saying to him, look, we're going to come back, we're going to set up a film, and I really want you to be the lead in it. I wanted it to be something that was an opportunity to showcase Silat as a cultural merit. And so Merentau was our opportunity to present that to a new audience. And, you know, we rode on the coattails of On Back, of what Tony Jaa was doing out in Thailand. It opened up the world to, okay, action cinema and martial arts cinema doesn't necessarily have to be just from Hong Kong. So it almost became, you know, thanks to On Back, it became the lightning in a bottle moment where I happened to be there, I happened to meet these people, I happened to kind of find an affinity for that martial art. I started to understand the movements and the dynamism of that martial art in terms of fighting high, fighting low, the flexibility of it, the sort of circular movements of it, the rhythms of it. I knew where I could put the camera, I knew where I needed to move the camera in order to sort of showcase that martial arts. Obviously, that doesn't come from nowhere. A large part of that came from just studying, watching the great work done by Pana in Thailand, the great work done by Sammo Hung and Jackie Chan and Yung Woo Ping, and studied the hell out of them. I remember watching Armour of God while I was writing Merentau on the background while I was typing away at the script. It was the fight with Jackie versus the monks. I remember just sitting there typing away and just hearing the punches and the blocks. I started to realize the punches, the timing, the rhythms of it, it's like percussion. So the block, 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 punch, block, 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 punch. It had a sort of almost like a musical feel to it. When I went into the choreography room with Iko and the guys then, I would always push for that, I would always strive for that. So we'd be designing fights with a sort of rhythm in mind. And that helped shape the work we've done since.
So how did you get from Merentau to The Raid?
After Merentau, I really wanted to make a different film before I did The Raid. And the storyline for that ended up becoming The Raid 2. And so we spent about a year trying to get that film off the ground, but it was way too ambitious for what we were trying to do as our second film. Required a much bigger budget than we were ever going to get locally. And so we kind of had to put it on the back burner, but I realized that because we had done about 2/3 of the choreography for that film, it was exciting to us because after Merentau, we started taking a slightly different approach in terms of how to shoot action. I'm good friends with Mike Leader, the casting director out in Hong Kong, and so he gave me some advice at the end of Merentau because obviously he saw the film and he kind of recognized we were doing a lot of long take steady cam shots in Merentau, that our actors and our fighters were getting burnt out by the end of each take because you're doing long stretches of a shot where there's no respite. He suggested maybe trying to design stuff with a few shorter shots in there because then they can become easier to achieve and easier to execute on set. It builds momentum. And then also, you're not allowing the audience to kind of be too far back from the action to the point where they can scrutinize if there's a miss-hit here or a slight lagging of pace there. That advice was really, really helpful, and we took that going forward with our design for what became the choreography for The Raid 2. And one of the investors had told us, I can't give you the full budget for what the film you want to do now, but if you could think of a different film that you can make for X amount, I can get you that and that'll be your budget and you can go off and make that film. Incentivized by that, we went off and then wrote The Raid 1. Having that new experience of a new way to look at design in action, knowing that the film wouldn't be about the cultural elements like we did on Merentau, it meant that we were able to have a little bit more bite and a little bit more grit to the choreography because of the psychology of the story. We jumped right in and then had to do entire another films with the choreography then, while shelving these old ideas that had helped get us to that place.
You've always utilised pre-viz or pre-visualization heavily for your action sequences, which we have seen today for Havoc. Can you talk about that process and why it's such a great tool for you?
Pre-viz is an interesting process. It's something that I've always had as a safety net. It goes back to when we were doing Merentau. I didn't want to be there on set and then not know how to shoot the scene. Not with the whole crew around sitting there waiting for you to make a decision. Pre-viz for me is always a tool through which I could be able to be comfortable with the action we were designing and the way we were going to present it. It's a given. It's the most invaluable tool I can have in my arsenal.
And just how strictly do you follow it in terms of from the pre-viz to what we as an audience see on screen?
It's a little bit of a Bible really in terms of how strictly we follow it. I'd say that for every sequence, it's about 90 to 95% exactly the same. So once we've shot that pre-viz, we've got that block of shots sitting on an edit. We can go through shot by shot by shot, and then when we're on location, start replacing those shots with the production version. So while I'm cutting the scene as we're shooting it, and then we'll drop it in there, and then we can see the cuts and go from pre-viz into the production shot back into pre-viz. And we know if those cuts are working, we know if the rhythms and the flow of the cut is working for us. And if it's not, then we know, okay, there might be something wrong with the shot, or we might need an extra bridging shot. And that's where that 5 to 10% wiggle room kicks in then. As opposed to shoot a ton of coverage, because we never shoot coverage, we shoot jigsaw pieces. You know when something's wrong right there and then while you're on location. So you have that time and that safety net to fix it. When it comes to the action in the films I've done, I've always tried to design the sequences in a way where it's not purely about spectacle alone. Obviously spectacle is going to play a part in it because you want the audiences to be wowed by what they're seeing, so there's always got to be a technical craft to it. But the best action sequences, they tell you something about the characters. Whether it's a journey of a character's arc in the middle of an action sequence or a new plot development within that sequence, I feel those are the sort of the ones which feel more organic to when you're telling a story. I think if it's just action for action's sake, it can get pretty tedious pretty fast. Especially I think in The Raid 2, we try to find elements of suspense and elements of tension building. So I kind of want to wind the audience up a little bit and get them on the cusp of knowing that at some point this little powder keg is going to explode. When it came to like the prison riot scene in The Raid 2, it was about Iko mistaking the maneuvering of certain gang members as if they're going to come and attack him, not realizing they're actually going to go and try and kill the mob boss's son that sat 2 or 3 seats away from him. And then in the midst of that, Iko realizing if he doesn't protect that mob boss's son, his investigation is over, because if he gets killed in this courtyard, then he's in prison for nothing. It was about developing the relationships of those characters, developing the plot points that are about to kick in, and finding a way to make Iko's character ingratiate himself within his undercover mission then.
Now, moving on slightly, I'd like to discuss, of course, the other genre you've explored more recently, horror. As you are so adept at both horror and action, do you feel a crossover between the genres?
Yeah, I think there's a healthy crossover between action and horror. They both share a visual language. When we were doing Apostle, my interest came from a desire to do something that was completely unexpected and do something that wasn't another version of the Raid. When we started designing Apostle, even though they were like small, tiny little action beats, and I can't help but shoot them in a way that still feels like what I would have done if I was doing another action movie, we tried to have them more restrained. We tried to have them still fit within the pretext of what horror film is supposed to do with action. They are very different in terms of how you would approach set pieces, but in terms of setting up atmosphere and trying to build suspense and tension, I feel like they share a lot of similarities. Horror has kind of crossed over into my work anyway, even with the Raid and the Raid 2. I always felt like the Raid 1 was more of a survival horror film that just happened to have martial arts action in it. Take away the bad guy gangsters in the building and swap them with zombies, it's a zombie film.
And in terms of changing style, you've recently explored a new venture, TV. Can you talk about the process of bringing the video game Gangs of London to the small screen?
It was pitched to me initially as, okay, here's the IP of the video game. In their first incarnation of it, they wanted to do like a film franchise. And while I was out in Indonesia, I had a concept for a TV show that I wanted to do out in Indonesia, but we'd never have got anywhere near the budget we needed to make a TV show of that scale and size out in Southeast Asia. And back then the concept was, okay, well, if episode 1 is about the funeral of a mob boss and what happens there when the power vacuum, emerges, and you have people swearing allegiances to each other, people betraying each other, old rivalries starting to re-energize. The thing that's great about London as a city, similar to New York, is that when you walk around there, you hear 15 different languages on every street. And it's so vibrant and so diverse. And so I said to him, look, if we do a film like this, then we're only really going to be able to spend 15 to 20 minutes of screen time with various other sort of subplots and other sub-characters. If we did long-form narrative, we did a television show, then we could have an episode that maybe devotes 2/3 of its runtime to other characters, other people. And so it became an evolving process, and where we just continued to develop the project with them. Bringing what we were doing in Indonesia over into the UK is a challenge in itself. Part of that was answered, thankfully, by meeting with Jude Poyer and his stunt team when we were doing Apostle. I got to see this way of emerging what we were doing in Indonesia, but over here in the UK, finding a new way to approach the action where we were way more keen to interrogate the design. So we don't kind of exist in a system of hierarchy. If you've got a good idea, let's hear it, and then let's all try to torpedo that good idea. If it stays afloat, then it can be part of that choreography. Okay, cut. Once more. And so it's kind of been finding a way to bring the style of action filmmaking from Indonesia over into the UK into a TV show schedule and budget, which is obviously a challenge in itself. We've been as ambitious as we could possibly manage over here in this time scale.
It is interesting you mentioned bringing the Indonesian style of action over to the UK, as of course you're doing that with your latest big action film, Havoc, right?
Cut. Absolutely. I mean, with Havoc, Havoc is kind of like almost like me wanting to take a step back into what I've done in Indonesia. Apostle was my foray into another genre and to kind of play within horror instead of pure action cinema. Gangs was dipping my toes back into action on a slightly smaller budget and a slightly smaller schedule. And so Havoc is going to be me unleashing the last 3 or 4 years of not doing something really big scale with action, and I couldn't be more thrilled to make that film next.
Amazing. Thank you, Gareth. And you will inevitably hear more about both Gangs of London and Havoc soon. I will say that the choreography you've seen here today is not fully representative of what they are actually doing for Havoc, as after all, the film is understandably very early in its development. This was a much smaller sequence the team put together as a demonstration for us. However, Gareth did show me a pre-viz action sequence from the film that I cannot show here, along with seeing another one they're in the process of recording that again was not filmed for this video. I don't want to give away much more than that, but suffice to say this team is putting something very special together. I'll be there day one to see it.